This podcast is recorded on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people.
British Columbia, I've seen your mountains high, seen your pretty rainbows and your blue crystal skies, watched your winding rivers as they flow around the bend. To me you're not a stranger, you'll always be a friend.
Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicoast. Today is July 9th, 2020, and this is episode 197.
I'm Scott Lundeboom.
And I'm Ian Bushfield. On today's show, WEgate continues. Bill Morneau gives us a peek at the country's books, and we have a roundup, as usual, of stories from BC and Canadian politics. Thank you again to the 101 people who contribute to us every month and keep the show going. We have no new patrons this week, but I want to give a special shout out this week to Elijah, Scott, Patrick, Ryan, Tora, and Stephen, who have all been supporting the show for over 3 years. We launched our Patreon in late May 2017, and you're all still with us. Some of you have given us quite a bit of money over that time, so thanks. If you want to join those cool people and help keep the show growing, go to patreon.com/politicoast. And coming up very soon, we'll have our big announcement as soon as we've decided what it is about our 200th episode that will be happening on July 30th. I promise we'll make an announcement in the next week. Sign up on Patreon to be the first to know. And if you want to be among the many devoted followers of the show and get involved in play-by-play analyses of municipal council hearings and other good political discussions, join our Patreon Slack, which is available to all listeners and supporters during the COVID-19 crisis. Go to legandbootmedia.ca and request an invite. Finally, Politicoast is in partnership with BC Today, British Columbia's daily newsletter dedicated exclusively to BC politics. Sign up for a free trial to have unique coverage of the BC legislature delivered to your inbox every morning. Listeners to Politicoast enter the offer code CITIZEN for access to a special rate. For your free 2-week trial of the newsletter, go to politicstoday.news/free-trial. Let's kick it off with our first segment, We or Me. I guess we're in our annual ethics probe with the federal government.
The annual ethics probe for Justin Trudeau specifically. I swear you could set your watch by these. They happen so regularly.
Yeah, we had the SNC-Lavalin scandal. We had the Aga Khan trip. Was there anything else, or were those the two big ones?
Those are the two big ones. This is number 3.
Which is not a great record in 6-7 years of governing. So it's maybe a little less than every year, but every 18 months to 2 years. It's quite a few ethics probes for any party. And when you're the Liberal Party, who have a history of or at least a brand that gets caught up with playing fast and loose with the rules sometimes, having additional ethics probes is not great. But let's maybe dig into the latest on the WE scandal.
Yeah, so after we recorded last week, but before we actually put out our episode, the federal government did a very hasty backtrack on awarding this $900+ million bid that was apparently sole source to the WE Foundation. Decided, nope, not going to do that. Pulled the plug. Didn't really explain why, if they were so insistent that this was the only organization in Canada that could possibly run it, why that suddenly wasn't the case.
So it sounded a bit like it was played up as WE's decision, that or it was a mutual decision initially. Trudeau said later on Friday afternoon that the decision to cut ties was WE's decision, which we, that being the government, support. That makes sense from the Kielburgers' point of view. If you're getting an incredible amount of scrutiny, all this extra attention and heat, walking away was probably the clean thing to do. You know, charity doesn't need that kind of, intense pressure and heat. So I can get why they did it, but whether the government also, whose idea it was and who initiated those conversations, I don't know if we'll ever know, but it's definitely to both the government and WE's benefit that they've parted ways.
I am curious who did initiate that discussion within the federal government about awarding this to WE, because it just seems so poorly thought out. Like, everybody should have known that this was going to cause a problem. Yet nobody seemed to have really stopped it in the PMO at all.
So Trudeau kept parroting the line, even as they were parting ways, that only We is the only charity that's got these quote-unquote connections to smaller charities to really make this happen. And I just don't believe that to be true. Like, there are organizations like Imagine Canada that work hard in the sector, or Volunteer Canada that work directly with putting volunteers in small charities and mid-sized charities. That makes, We is not the only one out there. We is big in schools, and We is big with pop stars and celebrities, but We is not big in the soup kitchens and mid-size environmental justice charities and whatever else is out there, part of the sector. And so it's just all got that feeling of chumminess, and that kind of runs through one of the stories we'll get to later. But the thing we alluded to off the top is that the ethics watchdog has kicked off an investigation into the decision to grant this contract.
So on the same day that the federal government announced they weren't going to go ahead with granting We this program, the ethics watchdog, Mario Dion, the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner, formally announced he was opening an investigation. This is after several opposition MPs wrote to him, asked him to do that. In fact, there's a bit of a kerfuffle over which party got to claim credit for this.
Well, at least Charlie Angus of the NDP and one of the Conservative MPs, Garnet Genuis, or someone else, wrote. But
I can't remember which Conservative MP it was.
It kind of doesn't matter in the end. The fact they wrote, I think Dion wrote back to the Conservatives to explain that he will be launching an investigation and some of the details of it. I mean, once one of them asked for it.
Michael Barrett.
Michael Barrett. Once one of them asked, the other had to ask as well. So
he will be initiating an investigation. His powers are ultimately fairly limited in what he can do, but nevertheless, it's not going to be politically good for Trudeau if the ethics watchdog does find that the rules were broken.
Yeah, we saw after SNC that I believe the watchdog or the commissioner issued a fairly damning report, which actually surprised quite a few people, but it came out in late summer, largely got buried by the news cycle, and like you say, he doesn't have the power to really do much more than wag a finger at the government. But if you have a pile of bad rulings from the Conflict of Interest Commissioner, it's not a great case to run into re-election in the future.
No, it isn't, and this is unlikely to bring the government down unless he finds something really damning in it, which maybe there's something to that, which we'll get to in a moment. But what it does do is it does build on kind of this existing narrative about Trudeau, and all of the major Trudeau scandals have basically followed a pattern of him being a little too chummy with some group, person, organization, and acting in a way that's not necessarily as detached as a prime minister should be, and like I said, being chummy when it's inappropriate. And that kind of just builds into this narrative that, Trudeau is this dilettante kid from a political family who's, acting for his own interests more and not the country as a whole.
And one of the big things that was being pushed by the government and we prior to today, and the story we're about to get to, is that there was this claim that members of the Trudeau family didn't receive any funding, any honoraria, any fees from the We charity for appearing at these We events. They may have gotten some travel expenses covered, but there was no stipend given. So there was no advantage given to the Trudeaus. Now, that kind of doesn't matter for Dion because the Conflict of Interest Acts, and he's looking at subsections 6.1 and section 6 and 7, all deal with just making decisions that further private interests of the public office holder or another person and giving someone preferential treatment. It's very clear when money is involved. Like if you give a government contract to a business who, is that your spouse runs, that's a clear conflict of interest because you personally benefit from that. But there is this level of influence peddling and sort of soft power and things that aren't just money related that do count as conflict of interest. And that's where he'll be investigating, at least in part.
Even if it wasn't written in that way in the legislation, it still shouldn't have happened, because it's important that the government seems to be acting above board, regardless of whether or not they're adhering strictly to the letter of the law. For the government to have legitimacy, both in the narrow political sense of the support of the Canadian public and in a broader meta level about support for our institutions in general, the government does need to be seen to be acting in the general public interest. And even if no laws were broken, it still should not have been okay for it to be run this way.
And despite that claim that no money really changed hand, it turns out We was being very selective in the focus there. So We Charity never directly paid any of the Trudeaus, except it turns out one time in error. But We also has the Me to We social enterprise, and it was broken by Canada Land and expanded upon, I think, by CBC this afternoon, that actually Margaret Trudeau has received $312,000 for 28 speaking events, which is over $11,000 an event. And Trudeau's brother Sasha has received $40,000 for 8 events. Now they didn't get the commission off those, so they got about $250,000 and $32,000 respectively. But that's a significant amount of money that has definitely gone to the Trudeau family from the We family of organizations. And it turns out that there was actually one instance when about $64,000 went from We Charity to Margaret Trudeau, which the organization then describes as a billing error, and they later had that paid by Me to We Social Enterprise, who is a sponsor of We events and happens to also be the same people. All this is to say, money has definitely changed hands, and it makes it a lot skeezier than it was even a week ago, which was hard to imagine.
It wasn't good when it just looked like Trudeau was giving his buddies a helping hand on this one, and it looks much, much worse when over $250,000 has gone directly to his mother and a other sizable sum to his brother. In theory, he might even one day inherit that money. So it's the sort of thing that's just not above board at all, and understandably is probably going to cause him a lot of problems, as it should.
And We Charity and Me to We are legally separate organizations, and I get the purposes of that. To any lay observer, these organizations have connections. There are a lot of the same people are involved, and at the very least, the optics of all of this are really bad. And the fact Trudeau and others didn't fess up to the fact this money had changed hands, because no one forgets that they've earned hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years, I would imagine. I don't know. I don't live in those circles.
The Trudeau family's fairly wealthy, but not billionaire wealthy where this just becomes a rounding error. There's no reason they shouldn't have known about that. And more to the point, there's no reason the staff at the PMO and whatever other bodies were formalized in this contract shouldn't have done their due diligence and looked into this.
So is it time for Trudeau to do as Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet has suggested, and for a few months step aside and leave the function, and perhaps Chrystia Freeland could step into the job until all of this is cleared?
Let's be serious what this is. This is all but calling for his resignation, because if the Prime Minister steps aside for a few months where there's an ethics investigation going on, that effectively destroys his Prime Ministership. So it's a call for resignation in all but name. And the opposition in this country needs to learn to keep their powder dry and not jump on the first opportunity to call for resignation. You saw Scheer make this exact mistake in the SNC Lavalin affair, where day 2 or something of it, he was out there calling for resignations before any of the facts were really out, before it had a chance to really sink in with Canadians. And it's far from clear that we're at that point now. We're still learning new stuff every day on this, and better to wait for a few more damage and bits to come out than jumping on it immediately.
Yeah, I give credit to Sheer for not calling for a resignation yet. That's actually surprising. That's a personal growth for him, I think. I don't even think
Give it a couple days.
Yeah, have the O'Toole or Peter McKay, I don't even think they've called for a resignation yet.
I'm not sure. I've been ignoring their emails.
Yeah, resignations are definitely something you just let them fall on their own sword when it's their time. You don't need to try to push them because it just looks petty.
Well, not only that, as the opposition, it's the nuclear button, or like the tier below. It's the tactical nuclear button rather than the strategic nuclear button, but it's still the nuclear button, pretty much short of bringing the government down in a non-confidence vote.
Oh, but see, I thought Tom Mulcair said the nuclear button was calling someone a racist. This is what he actually said about Jagmeet Singh. I don't know why anyone gives Thomas Mulcair a microphone anymore.
Okay, I'm not sure what WMD analogy that falls under, but it's definitely not the nuclear button.
But yeah, Blanchet definitely, used his strongest words he could here. And where do you go?
Yeah, and then where does he go from here? That's the problem with this, is once you use it, then what? There's no way to escalate this further short of forcing an election, which nobody's really prepared for.
Maybe Blanchet is.
I'm not sure. Like, the Bloc did pretty well. They hold the balance of power somewhat. Like, Trudeau will be courting their votes on issues. It's not clear that that's going to be the case come the end of a fraught election period.
Well, in the meantime, I guess we'll be waiting to see what more gems drop about the Me charity, the Me to We social enterprise, and anything else in this scandal. With the ethics commissioner investigating it, we will expect a report out at some point, and hopefully that helps dig into a little bit how we got into this mess. And in the meantime, I hope at least the government can get those grants out on its own. It's not a perfect program. I don't really like the idea of paying volunteers less than minimum wage. They're either staff where they get minimum wage or they're volunteers. But, if we're going to have a volunteering grant program, let's at least, not hurt the people it's trying to benefit.
The one thing I'll say before we move on is, for months we were talking about, when is politics as normal going to reemerge? We were in this kind of weird crisis period where, politics had been put aside to the extent that it's possible to do so. And now that we have come out of it, it's going to be a lot more politics as normal. There's going to be more fighting. The rally around the flag effect is probably at its end, and that's going to put Trudeau in a lot more vulnerable position because of the crisis and the fact that kind of politics was largely put aside. You haven't had as tough questions. There hasn't been the real scrupulous look at everything that's going on. The hundreds of billions of dollars that are going out the door, what that means for the long term, and we'll get to that in a couple minutes. But the benefit of the doubt is now gone, and that's going to make it a lot tougher for this minority government to navigate those waters going forward.
Well, let's move on to talk about those record-breaking numbers.
Yeah, so we'll move on to segment 2, our record-breaking snapshot. Yesterday, Finance Minister Bill Morneau released the fiscal snapshot, which is a new thing. This isn't a fiscal update or a budget, but it's kind of, I guess, a mini fiscal update that only really covers what's happening right now in the next few months. The headline takeaway from this is that there's expected to be a $343 billion deficit for 2020. And for the record, that was pretty much the size of the entire government spending before this over the course of a year. That is up from $34.4 billion, which is effectively a tenfold increase. And this is in large part thanks to the $236 billion spent to date, plus what they're projecting forward over the next couple months.
It's fun. We've hit a total debt of $1.2 trillion, which is a number I cannot comprehend in any possible way. It's not all bad news in a way, I mean, the federal debt to GDP ratio, like you said, it's up to, and headlines are talking about how it's up to rates not seen for several decades. We're at 49% for this year, up from 31%.
That's still in the healthy range.
Well, and the big thing right now is that we have absurdly low interest rates. So, like, we're looking at possibly refinancing our mortgage or getting moving into a new place. And the banks are basically like, if you break your mortgage, you might come out ahead. So, and we only got our mortgage like 18 months ago at 3.4, and they're already down to like 2.4. So rates are low. The government is actually expecting that despite all of this, the cost to service our debt will be $4 billion lower this year than it was projected to be.
Is a little uncertain. They've announced their plan. They're going to be trying to put this debt out there in terms of 10, 30-year bonds, 50. I even heard speculation today on some podcast I was listening to of a 100-year bond. I mean, who knows if there's actually an appetite in the market for that, which is the thing that is remaining to be seen on here, is how much uptake a 30-year bond paying out at 1% or less, how much interest is there in that?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, overall, we're in still a pretty good situation. The Conservatives are quick to point out that Canada did get downgraded by one credit agency, though most others still keep us at a AAA credit rating. Like, it's tough, right? We're in a unprecedented situation, and so to have these numbers isn't that shocking in a way. I mean, if you are following along and adding things up, this seems about where we should be.
49% of GDP at what maybe the lowest interest rate ever, or close to the lowest interest rate ever, is still pretty healthy. Even when interest rates were higher, it was generally considered by economists to be well within the healthy range if you're anywhere under 100% of debt to GDP. And, it's the federal government, the sovereign borrower, there's a bunch of advantages they have that, in theory, give them even more flexibility on this. The Bank of Canada is doing what it can to keep interest rates low, maybe buying up a bunch of the debt as well, which is effectively would be printing money, but inflation's still pretty low, so that's not a huge problem at this time. It's like, overall, it's worrying. If this $300+ billion deficit is a recurring thing over the next half decade, we might be facing some serious problems, but we're not in the stage where anyone needs to panic yet, despite the opposition doing a little bit to try and get that going. But what's still a little unclear is what's the path out, and there's a reason they did this as a snapshot rather than as a full fiscal update, because that's still a big unknown. We don't know how quickly the economy will recover once there is a vaccine and COVID's controlled, and we also don't know when that is going to be. So we're in this tough spot. It's really hard to pontificate much beyond this, because the error bars, once we go past the fall, are just so big.
It does get really hard to hold a government to account when it's refusing to even put big error bars out there. So I get the criticism that, there are smart people in the Ministry of Finance. The opposition does not have the resources they do to plot this out. So making some projections beyond 2021 could be more healthy or could be more useful. But also, if you're government and you can get away with not making those predictions, why not take that easier path? The other numbers I was looking at in this are more on the health of the economy from sort of two perspectives. In the short term, GDP this year was expected to shrink about 6.8% now, but they're expecting it to bounce back to a 5.5% growth next year. Now, when something crashes, a big growth can be not bring you back to where you were, but a 5.5% growth would still be a nice swing around.
Just the way the math works on it, it's if you go down 6% and then go up 6%, you're still not quite where you were, because the 6% growth is measured as 6% of a lower baseline. So it's almost a little deceptive that, yeah, we're going down and back up, but the gap is still a lot bigger than the headline numbers just suggest.
And on the unemployment rate, it, as far as they can tell, peaked at about 14% in second quarter of this year. And it will probably return closer to pre-pandemic levels of around 7% by the end of next year, which means they're fairly optimistic most people will be returning to work or some kind of work, which is a pretty positive thing. Although, again, what the nature of that work looks like will still be determined. Moving on to quick takes. Let's start off in America, where Trump has formally notified the United Nations that the United States of America will be withdrawing from the World Health Organization and pulling the majority of that organization's funding along with it, which is great in no way.
I mean, what can you say to this beyond the fact that the largest single funder withdrawing in the middle of a pandemic from the World Health Organization is a bad thing?
I mean, CBC points out in a sentence that Trump's trailing Biden in multiple polls and has sought to deflect criticism of the administration's handling of the virus by aggressively attacking China and the WHO, and that analysis seems about as astute as any.
It's not necessarily wrong. Like, there was a bunch of screw-ups on both of those parties' accounts, particularly in the early days of this. But nevertheless, it's not in a great spot to... Doing this now doesn't actually help anything. It doesn't resolve those problems. It doesn't change anything out. It just takes resources out of the fight when they can't be spared. The other thing here that Trump has criticized the WHO on is being too much in China's pocket, and the worst possible thing to do if that is your big concern is withdraw and lose all your influence in the WHO as a result. I mean, this is part of a broader strategic failure by the Trump administration to take seriously the need to engage in multilateral institutions precisely to keep competing powers in check. And hopefully Biden will turn that around, but it's hard to say. And the one thing I will also note is that this doesn't actually take effect. He's given notice, but the formal withdrawal period is not until next year. So in theory, it's possible for Biden to reverse it if he wins, as he is likely to do.
The other fun point about this is apparently under the WHO's constitution, to withdraw, you can't be in arrears. You can't owe money. Essentially, you're past debt. And the U.S., I guess, owes something like $200 million in past dues. It provides $400 million a year, so if they don't pay, they can't leave, I guess.
Yes, but this is Trump. Like, the guy famous for skipping out on his debts. And, what's the WHO going to do? Like, there isn't actually a way to enforce it.
He'll just not be showing up at meetings, and they'll have to, they'll keep sending them invoices. But yeah, I looked up the numbers of COVID-19 in the U.S. today just to put them in context, because I don't think the WHO has been the failure at responding to this that America is quickly becoming. There were almost 59,000 confirmed COVID-19 cases today in the United States, another 829 deaths, bringing their total death count to 132,309. Anyone who's looked at the charts recently has seen there's been a massive upswing, and the death toll hasn't gone, or the daily death toll hasn't tracked that quite yet, but as cases are confirmed, people might not live too much longer, which is a terrifying thought. It's not a good time to be, especially in the southern states. I think Florida in particular is just out of control. So let's keep that border closed, I guess.
Yeah, there's actually a bunch of Congress people who sent a letter to our government asking for us to reopen our borders or start the process. We rightfully said no pretty quick, but that did happen, and I'm glad that government is in no rush to get things opened up. Goods are still flowing across. There's still essential travel happening. It's like the real stop is people on non-essential travel, and with everything else going on, that seems pretty reasonable. Moving on to our next quick take. The BC Green Party leadership race got a little more exciting this week as the former Green Party leader Elizabeth May endorsed Sonia Furstenau in her bid to become leader of the provincial Green Party.
I don't know if this really makes it more exciting or more of a done deal. Like, Kim Darwin is still in the race, and we're hoping to talk to her soon. We'll be reaching out soon if her team isn't listening.
Well, it's more exciting because it's actually news about this leadership race, which is faded into the background with everything else that's been going on.
That's true.
But like you said, Sonia Furstenau is the clear favorite and front runner right now. So how much this helps is probably not a huge amount on the margin.
At least it brings some attention to the race. The next big follow-up story on the provincial scene is the Special Committee on Reforming the Police Act has been announced. This we teased a couple weeks ago when we talked about policing issues and the fact Mike Farnworth had committed to announcing a committee to study the issue and to look at updating the province's police act. Well, we have a all-party committee that includes 4 New Democrats, 4 BC Liberals, and Adam Olsen for the Greens. It'll be chaired by Nicholas Simons, Gary Begg, Bowen Ma, and Rashna Singh fill out the New Democrats caucus on there. Jazz Johal, Mike Morris, Elis Ross, and Michelle Stillwell are representing the BC Liberals. The terms of reference are out. Essentially, look at reforms relating to oversight, transparency, governance, structure, training, education, and so forth, including funding to modernize and make more sustainable policing under the Police Act. Look at the role of policing with respect to complex social issues, including mental health, wellness, addictions, harm reduction, and look at any necessary related change to the Mental Health Act. Number 3, look at the scope of systemic racism within BC's police agencies, including the RCMP, local police, designated policing units, etc. And finally, whether there's any necessary amendments to the Police Act to bring it in line with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People.
Yeah, so this isn't probably what the Abolish the Police advocates are going to be happy with, but nevertheless, it seems like a pretty solid set of reforms to evaluate.
Yeah, I think the one thing a lot of people were disappointed or called out that wasn't in there is Provincial Health Officer Dr. Bonnie Henry's previous recommendations that the province could use the Police Act and the powers within it to effectively decriminalize drugs in BC, essentially tell police to stop enforcing certain criminal code offenses. And Mike Farnworth said, that's a separate issue that we'll consider on its own, or it deserves to be considered on its own, i.e. they don't want to do it. And so they'll focus just on the structure of policing, I guess, in this situation.
Yeah, it's also a bit tricky, though, just because decriminalization isn't really something that's constitutionally, in theory, part of the provincial government's responsibilities, and it opens the door to a nasty jurisdictional fight with the federal government. So I can see why it got left off of the terms of reference.
I mean, I believe her report, when she released it, did lay out a very clear path on how this could be done without really stepping into the federal government's jurisdiction by focusing on the decriminalization of people who use drugs and prioritizing other approaches. But rather than relitigate that, I mean, like you say, this is a pretty broad-based terms of reference. I think the lineup on this committee is really positive, both from the NDP side, where you have people including Gary Begg, who I believe Begg is a former cop, he was a former RCMP officer. Bowen Ma and Rashna Singh have both been strong advocates for civil liberties and justice. Elis Ross and Adam Olsen are both Indigenous and have different experiences there. I'm really interested to see what they come up with and how this team approaches this question.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see where this comes back with, and what the actual recommendations are going to be, and also what the government will act on them.
It's one of those ones where I'm possibly optimistic they can come to an all-party consensus. Like you say, it won't meet the peak of activist demands, but that's kind of what activists exist for, is to set the bar, whether it's realistic or not, and government doesn't meet that, but might move a bit more in that direction. The only other thing I wanted to mention in relation to this story is it was interesting this past week. The Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police actually came out and released a statement saying they would support the decriminalization of personal possession of illicit substances and instead have that be a more health-focused approach rather than a criminal justice approach. Now, they'd still obviously consider trafficking and drug dealing and those kind of offenses to be criminal issues, and especially the organized crime elements. But rather than dealing with the person using on the street, let that person interface with harm reduction and healthcare facilities, which seems to be the evolving consensus. So hopefully we can start to see some movement at the federal level beyond. I think only the NDP has really taken it up. I think the federal Liberal members have supported broad decriminalization, but the Liberal Party of Canada is still reticent.
Yeah, this isn't a government that's exactly known for its risk-taking on a lot of these sorts of issues. So maybe they'll do something, maybe not. Maybe they'll do something like moves it very slightly towards it and call mission accomplished.
Chiefs of police are not known for their radical progressive viewpoints in my mind. This is a definition of a small C conservative club, so welcome to the Decriminalize the Drugs team.
Yeah, although I think police are not particularly thrilled about being the frontline, mental health workers on a lot of situations, so it does kind of make sense why they'd be pushing for this as well.
Well, as a follow-up to a story we mentioned last week or a couple weeks ago, Mary Ellen Turple-Lafond had been appointed to investigate the range and extent of anti-Indigenous racism in the healthcare system following some troubling reports of super racist behavior. She's started her investigation, she announced, and she's announced that several themes have already emerged, largely that, Indigenous people are reporting when they go seeking healthcare, they're repeatedly questioned about whether they're drunk or dealing with addictions before they receive general care. She's outlined what the scope of her report will be, and it's not a question of whether there's racism out there. It's a question of, how does it manifest? What are the issues? She's also pointed out those specific hospitals where these incidents are happening, they don't need to wait for the recommendations. They kind of know what needs to be done in terms of tackling anti-Indigenous racism and should probably start doing it right away. But she wants to have her report done within a few months and to really have those implemented through the healthcare system. So it'll be interesting to watch that report come out. She's launched a public consultation website, engage.gov.bc.ca/addressing racism. And if you see racism in the healthcare system, you can call the toll-free number 888-600-3078 or email addressing_racism@gov.bc.ca. So they have all the communication methods. Would you call it a racism snitch line?
Suppose you could.
I'm not generally in favor of snitch lines, but maybe this is a good one to have.
Well, moving on to a quick follow-up from our discussion last week regarding the advertisements by various MLAs in publications that feature homophobic content. Press Progress is reporting that one MLA, Marvin Hunt, has continued to advertise with Light Magazine, which we discussed last week, despite Andrew Wilkinson saying that he'd put in an immediate review and expects all his MLAs to cease advertising.
Press Progress notes right at the bottom update that Marvin Hunt's ads did disappear from Light Magazine's July 2020 online articles following the publication of their statement, their story. There's no comment from either Light Magazine or the BC Liberals about why those got removed, probably because they were embarrassing. However, noted social conservative, like the most infamous one, Laurie Thronis, has repeatedly said he doesn't care. He'll advertise wherever he damn well pleases. He even managed to go out and told CTV, biblical Christians follow their Lord in their sexual practice. They don't attack other people. They don't condemn other people because Jesus did not condemn other people. They withdraw from sex outside of a marriage between a man and a woman. That has nothing to do with intolerance. It has everything to do with following their conscience and following the Lord. He's basically doubled down. He likes the magazine. I mean, I don't know how much more legs this story has, but the weight of the social conservatives on the BC Liberals is kind of always going to be there. But at the same time, if they don't have that base, like if the BC Conservatives become the home for social conservatives or some other party, and they pick off 5% of the vote in some key, Metro Van ridings, it can swing a lot of seats to the NDP. The Liberals need those votes, but they need to not be embarrassed by those people.
Yeah, and I mean, at this point, Laurie Thrones is just a known quantity. I'm not sure how much his just continued existence is going to really change things one way or the other. So yeah, I expect we probably won't be talking about this in the following weeks for the reasons you mentioned. But one idea that we, for some reason, do keep seeming to talk about, though I can't imagine why, is Wexit, the worst named political idea in possibly all of Canadian history. So Abacus has a new poll out asking Canadians what do they think of Western separation from Canada. Unsurprisingly, most Canadians aren't fond of it, although there is a bit of a partisan split on this, or at least a split within one of the parties, that being the Conservatives.
There is also a regional split where Quebecers are most likely to support anyone leaving the country. They're like, yeah, everyone should go. Why not?
Yeah, well, it's the same reason, Catalonians have, very favorable views of... I'm trying to think of another European separatist example.
Do the Walloons want to separate?
Maybe, I don't know. Belgium's a weird mix of disparate cultures, but there's a reason they have...
Maybe Scotland,
yeah. There's a reason the Catalonians have, favorable views of Scottish separation.
Breaking into the specific numbers, 12% of British Columbians think that British Columbia separating is a good idea. 13% of Albertans think Alberta separating is a good idea. And 10% of both Saskatchewan and Manitobans, respectively, think their province leaving would be a good idea.
The only reason I think BC is a little higher is because you get 2.5% of, diehard Cascadian separatists.
Well, and it's all within a margin of error on this size of a survey. The I could live with it samples range from 22 to 26%. There's basically 2/3 of people in each province thinks it's a terrible idea. So I kind of think it's worth sticking the nail in this narrative, and we shouldn't have to talk about it. I did want to bring this survey up because I thought it was interesting to actually have the numbers there. And there was also a bit more press for the Wexit Canada party because Jay Hill, who was one of Harper's former government house leaders, is now the leader of that party somehow. Usually it's a backbencher who goes off and joins these fringe movements, not someone who got a reasonably prominent position in caucus.
Maybe he's just bored in retirement. It wouldn't be the first time someone takes up a weird hobby when they don't have other work to occupy themselves with.
Some people start crochet, some people go RVing, some people lead fringe separatist movements.
And that has been Playtoast. Find links to everything we talked about at playtoast.ca. Support the show and get access to our Slack channel at patreon.com/playtoast. Our intro music credit is Beautiful British Columbia by Serge Plotnikoff. Playtoast is a production of Legend Boot Media, and editing services are provided by CHLY 101.7 FM in Nanaimo. Wash your hands and stay home. Thanks for listening.